Metaphysics and Dialectic by René Guénon. We recently learned of an article that seems to deserve some attention because certain of the misapprehensions it evinces have been taken so far. Footnote: Massimo Scaligero, Esoterismo Moderno, l'opera e il pensiero di René Guénon, in the first issue of the new Italian journal Imperium, May 1950. The expression modern esoterism is itself already rather significant because it is a self-contradictory statement, and then again because there is quite obviously nothing modern about our work, which is on the contrary and in every respect the very opposite of the modern spirit. We were, of course, amused to read that those who have some experience of metaphysical knowledge, among whom the author obviously places himself, even while with a remarkable impudence denying us the privilege, as if he could possibly know, will find nothing in our work but remarkably precise conceptual distinctions, that is, distinctions of a purely dialectical order, and representations that may serve as useful preliminaries, but that, from the practical and methodological point of view, do not advance one step beyond the realm of words toward the universal. But we greatly fear that our contemporaries, so accustomed to stopping at external appearances, will commit similar errors. When we see them falling into error regarding traditional authorities, such as Shankaracharya, for example, there is assuredly no reason for surprise that they do the same with regard to us, taking the husk for the kernel. However this may be, we would like to know how truth of any order whatsoever could be expressed without the use of words, excepting the case of purely symbolic figures, which are not under discussion here, and without a dialectical form. In short, those discursive forms imposed by the very requirements of all human language, and also given the subject under discussion, how any verbal explanation, whether written or oral, could be more than a useful preliminary. It seems, however, that we have sufficiently stressed the essentially preparatory character of all theoretical knowledge, which is obviously the only knowledge that can be attained through a study of such explanations. But this is not at all to say that, in this respect and within these limits, it is not rigorously indispensable for all those who then wish to go further. And to avoid any misunderstanding, let us immediately add that, contrary to what is said regarding a passage from our Perspectives on Initiation, we have never had the intention of saying anything about either our own inner experience, which is of no concern or interest to anyone, or anyone else's, since it is always something strictly incommunicable by its very nature. Fundamentally, the author scarcely seems to understand what we mean by the term metaphysical, and even less what we mean by pure intellectuality, the transcendent character of which he would like to deny, thus betraying the common confusion between intellect and reason, an error not unrelated to another he commits concerning the role of dialectic in our writings, and, we could also say, in any writing concerned with this same realm. This is all too obvious when he asserts that the ultimate meaning of our work, about which he speaks with an assurance that his incomprehension scarcely warrants, resides in a mental transparency, not recognized as such and with limits that are still human, which we see at work when we take this transparency for effective initiation. Faced with such assertions, we must once again repeat as clearly as possible that there is absolutely no difference between pure and transcendent intellectual knowledge, which, as such, and contrary to rational knowledge, has nothing mental or human about it, that is to say, effective and not merely theoretical metaphysical knowledge, and initiatic realization, any more than between pure intellectuality and true spirituality. This explains why the author considered it necessary to speak out, and even with some vehemence, about our thought, that is, about something which, strictly speaking, ought to be considered as non-existent, or at least ought to count for nothing when applied to our work, since it is not at all what we have put into the latter, which is exclusively an exposition of traditional data, only the expression being our own. This data, furthermore, is not the product of any kind of thought whatsoever, by very reason of its traditional character, which essentially implies a supra-individual and non-human origin. His error in this regard appears most clearly when he claims that we have mentally rejoined the idea of the infinite, which, moreover, is an impossibility. We have not, in fact, rejoined it mentally or otherwise, for this idea, and again this word can only be used in such cases if we rid it of the exclusively psychological meaning currently ascribed to it, can only be grasped directly by an immediate intuition that belongs, we repeat, to the domain of pure intellectuality. All the rest are but means intended to prepare for this intuition those capable of it. It must be understood that as long as they are only thinking through these means, they will achieve no effective results, any more than someone who reasons or reflects on what are commonly called the proofs of the existence of God will attain an effective knowledge of divinity by this means alone. What it is necessary to know is that concepts as such, and above all abstractions, do not interest us in the least. It goes without saying that this us includes all who, like ourselves, adopt a strictly and integrally traditional point of view, and we willingly leave all these mental elaborations to philosophers and other thinkers. Footnote: for us, the very type of the thinker, in the proper sense of the word, is Descartes. Whoever is simply that, and nothing more, will inevitably become a rationalist, since he is incapable of passing beyond the exercise of the purely individual and human faculties, and is hence necessarily unaware of anything beyond their reach, which means that he can only be agnostic regarding everything pertaining to the metaphysical and transcendent realm. But when obliged to explain matters of an altogether different order, and especially in a Western language, we fail to see how one can avoid using words that, in the majority of cases, in fact, only express simple concepts in current usage, since there are no others at our disposal. Footnote: we need only accept those words stemming from traditional terminology, in which case it is natural enough to restore their original meaning. If some are incapable of understanding the transposition that must be effectuated in such a case in order to fathom the ultimate meaning, there is, unfortunately, nothing we can do about it. As for trying to discover in our work traces of the limits of our own knowledge, this is a waste of time, for aside from this having nothing to do with us, our explanations are strictly impersonal by the very fact that they refer exclusively to truths of a traditional order. And if we have not always succeeded in making this characteristic perfectly obvious, this should be ascribed rather to difficulties of expression. Footnote: in this respect, we have always regretted that the habits of our times have not permitted us to publish our works in the strictest anonymity, which, if nothing else, would have forestalled the writing of much nonsense and spared us the trouble of taking it up and correcting it. This reminds us only too well of those who suppose that anyone who intentionally refrains from speaking about a thing is either ignorant of it or does not understand it. As for esoteric dialectic, this expression is acceptable only if one means by it dialectic in the service of esoterism, as the external means used to communicate what can be expressed verbally, and always with the reservation that such an expression is necessarily inadequate, especially in the purely metaphysical order, by the very fact that it is formulated in human terms. Dialectic is, after all, nothing but the use or practical application of logic. Footnote: we are, of course, taking dialectic strictly in its original sense, the sense it had, for example, for Plato and Aristotle, without being in the least concerned about the special meanings attributed to it nowadays, which are derived more or less directly from Hegel's philosophy. Now, it hardly needs pointing out that the moment one wishes to say something, it becomes necessary to conform to the laws of logic, which certainly does not mean that in themselves the truths to be expressed are dependent on these laws, any more than the fact that a draftsman is obliged to sketch a picture of a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional surface thereby proves his ignorance of the existence of the third dimension. Logic does, in fact, dominate everything pertaining to reason, and as its name indicates, this is its proper domain. But on the other hand, everything of the supra-individual, and therefore supra-rational order, by this very fact, obviously escapes that domain, for the superior could not be subservient to the inferior. Regarding truths of this order, logic can therefore only intervene in an incidental way, and their expression in discursive or dialectical mode is a kind of descent to the individual level, failing which these truths would remain totally incommunicable. Footnote: we shall not dwell on the reproach addressed to us that we speak as if transcendence and so-called external reality were separate from each other. If the author knew what we have stated about descending realization, or if he had understood it, he would certainly have dispensed with this criticism. This does not in any case alter the fact that this separation really exists in its own order, which is that of contingent existence, and that it ceases only for the one who has passed beyond this existence and is definitively free of its limiting conditions. Whatever he may think, it is always important to know how to situate each thing in its rightful place and at its proper degree of reality, and these are surely not distinctions of a purely dialectical order. With singular inconsistency, the author, even while reproaching us, through pure and simple incomprehension, moreover, for stopping at the mental level without realizing it, seems particularly embarrassed by the fact that we speak of the renunciation of the mental. What he says on this subject is quite confused, but at bottom he seems unwilling to admit that the limits of individuality can be transcended, and that, as regards realization, for him everything is restricted if we may express it so, to a sort of exaltation of these limits, since he claims that the individual by itself tends to rediscover its original source, which is precisely an impossibility for the individual as such, since it obviously cannot surpass itself by its own means. And if this source were of an individual order, it would still be something very relative. If the being which is a human individual were truly nothing more than a being in a certain state of manifestation, there would be no way for him to emerge from the conditions of this state, and as long as he has not effectively emerged from it, that is, as long as he is still only an individual according to appearances, and we must not forget that for his present consciousness these appearances are confounded with reality itself, since they are all that he can attain of it, all that is necessary to enable him to go beyond them can only present itself as external. Footnote. It hardly seems necessary to remind the reader here that initiation naturally takes the aspirant as he is in his present state, in order to give him the means for transcending it, which is why such means may at first seem external. For he has not yet arrived at the stage where such distinctions as interior and exterior cease to be valid. Every conception that tends to deny these incontestable truths is nothing but a manifestation of modern individualism, whatever illusions those who hold to them may entertain in this regard. Footnote. At present, many people sincerely believe themselves to be anti-modern, and yet are deeply affected by the influence of the modern spirit, which moreover is merely one of many examples of the confusion that reigns everywhere in our time. And in the present instance, the final conclusions, which are in fact equivalent to a negation of tradition and initiation under the pretext of rejecting all recourse to exterior means of realization, show only too well that this is indeed so. The author's conclusions now remain to be examined, and here there is at least one passage we must cite in its entirety. Quote, in the interior constitution of modern man, there is a fracture that makes tradition appear to be an external collection of doctrines and rites, and not a superhuman current of life into which he might plunge himself in order to revive. In modern man lives the error that separates the transcendent world from that of the senses, so that he perceives the latter as deprived of the divine. Hence, reunion or reintegration cannot come about through an initiatic form that antedates the time in which such an error became an accomplished fact. Unquote. We, too, are altogether of the opinion that this is indeed a most serious error, and also that this error, which, properly speaking, constitutes the profane point of view, is so characteristic of the modern spirit itself as to be truly inseparable from it, to the extent that, for those dominated by this spirit, there is no hope of freeing themselves from it. It is obvious that from the initiatic point of view, this error is an insurmountable disqualification, which is why modern man is really unfit to receive an initiation, or at least to attain to effective initiation. But we should add that there are exceptions, because, in spite of everything, even in the West today, there are men who, by their interior constitution, are not modern men, but are capable of grasping the essence of tradition, and do not accept this profane error as a fait accompli. And it is to these that we have always intended to address ourselves exclusively. But this is not all, for the author next falls into a curious contradiction, for he seems to want to present as progress what he first recognized as error. Let us again quote his own words. Quote, to hypnotize men with the mirage of tradition and of an orthodox organization to transmit initiation is in effect to paralyze that possibility of liberation and the conquest of liberty that for present-day man lies strictly in the fact that he has attained the ultimate degree of knowledge, that he has become conscious even to the point that the gods, the oracles, the myths, and the initiatic transmissions are no longer effective. Unquote. This is assuredly a strange misunderstanding of the real situation, for never has man been further than at present from the ultimate degree of knowledge, unless this be understood in the descending direction, and if he has really arrived at the point where all the things enumerated above no longer have an effect on him, it is not because he has climbed too high, but on the contrary because he has fallen too low, as is shown moreover by the fact that their many more or less crude counterfeits are quite effective in unbalancing him further. There is much talk about autonomy, the conquest of liberty, and so forth, always understood in a purely individualistic sense, but it is forgotten, or rather remains unknown, that true liberation is only possible through emancipation from the limits inherent to the individual condition. One no longer wishes to hear of regular initiatic transmission or of traditional orthodox organizations, but what of the altogether comparable case of a man who, on the point of drowning, refuses the help offered him by a rescuer because it is external. Whether we like it or not, the truth is, and this has nothing to do with any dialectic whatsoever, that outside of an affiliation with a traditional organization, there is no initiation, and that without first being initiated, no metaphysical realization is possible. These are neither mirages and ideal illusions, nor vain speculations of thought, but entirely positive realities. Doubtless our opponent will argue that anything we say remains in the realm of words. By the very nature of things, this is only too evident, and is equally true of what he says, but with one essential difference. However convinced he himself may be to the contrary, his words, for whoever understands their ultimate meaning, reflect nothing but the mental attitude of a profane person, and we ask him to believe that this is not meant as an insult on our part, but is merely the technical expression of a simple fact.